Welcome to lesson 2 in painting Van Gogh's Starry Night together. In this lesson we're going to start painting in the sky section of our acrylics. I've laid out the colours that we're going to start with. For this project I've chosen to use Winsor & Newton Galleria acrylics. They're a good paint to use, they have good opacity, they're easy to handle. They're easy to use, they spread well, they move well, they're very user friendly. Okay, so I've chosen 6 colours to start with the sky. So if you remember, this is the picture we're going to be using. This is the reference picture. I always suggest printing it out on photo paper because you get clarity of colour and it's much easier to follow along when you've printed it out on photo paper. Try printing it on A4 photo paper. You can go to any good supermarket and pick a pack of A4 photo paper. So for this project I've chosen for this lesson powder blue, titanium white, cadmium yellow, medium hue. So you could just use a cadmium yellow, pale lemon, cerulean blue hue, which we won't be using much of. I'm not a fan of it for the sky, but there are patches and areas where it's more of a turquoise colour, but not much. Cobalt blue hue. Okay, so there are 6 colours. Move them to one side. So I've then built up a palette. Now I like to use a daisy palette, and I like to use a ceramic daisy palette. I prefer ceramic because I feel it's cooler in temperature wise, which means your paints last longer. Once acrylic dries you can't reactivate it. You just throw it away. It keeps the paint going longer, a ceramic palette. They're easier to clean and there's less staining. I've chosen the ceramic daisy palette so I can put my 6 colours on the outside with the white in it, but I've also put a bit of white in the middle. The reason being is we're going to mix a paler blue with the cobalt. So we're going to be taking some of this cobalt and we're going to be making a blue out of it that's in between the powder blue and the cobalt blue here. Okay, so we also have a pot of water, and what I use to wipe my brushes is an old J cloth. The brushes I'm using today are De La Rowney graduate brushes plus System 3 De La Rowney brushes. So I'm using a filled brush and a round brush. We'll be mostly using a round brush. I don't use acrylics with a lot of water. I thin them down slightly, but I don't use a lot of water. I don't find you need to. What I do is I only use paint up halfway up my brushes, up the bristles of my brush. If you find your acrylic paint is going further up than halfway up your bristles, you're using too much paint. Damp your brush. Take any excess off the side of your palette, dip it into your paint. You don't need much more than this on your brush. And let's start by going round the outside of the moon. We're going to keep to brush strokes that are contouring round. If it's starting to catch on the canvas, use a little more water so it's the same consistency as good quality ready-made custard. That's the kind of consistency you're after. So the custard you buy in cartons. Now, it doesn't matter if your yellow is see-through or transparent at this stage. All yellows are translucent. You can build them up in layers. This is our first layer. So this is fine if we've got canvas showing through. We also want to leave spaces for your brush strokes. And for texture. What we don't want to do is lose texture and brush strokes by painting it in too quick. So we're going to do one area at a time. If we paint too far up, whereas I've taken this too far up to the edge, it's not that yellow up to the top, but that's okay, because with acrylic you can layer. So let's pick up some of the cadmium yellow. If your pencil lines show through, again, that's absolutely fine, because we're going to be layering this paint. Now I hold my brush quite far down the handle, almost towards the bristles. It's preference how you hold your brush, it's personal. I find I have more control. It's worth adjusting the hold of your brush to find what suits you. Okay, so let's mix a little bit of these two yellows together, just on one side of this palette, to make a mid-tone yellow, just for a bit of variation in these brush strokes, but we're still going to be curving them round this circular shape and filling in the weave of the canvas. Van Gogh created movement in his sky. It's what made his sky special in Starry Night. So it's important to keep the brush strokes. We don't want to smooth them out. And in between moving areas, give your brush a wash off and dry the excess water. Okay, so moving on to a smaller star. What you can do is put your cadmium into the middle this time. Make some smaller brush strokes around the outside. Then put in your lemon yellow. If it becomes too thick yellow, don't worry about it. You can always go over it later, once it's dry. It's not a bother at all. Wash your brush off. Then dry it on your piece of cloth. Move to your next star. Put your cadmium in the middle, and then take your brush strokes outwards. Leave some spaces in between your brush strokes. Don't be worried if your pencil lines show through, because we will go back and layer. And as you can see, I'm not picking up water. I'm not picking up a lot of water in between. So I'm not diluting this. If you were to dilute yellow with water, it would become too translucent. Then you really would struggle to cover the area. Keep your brush strokes circular around each star. And remember, when he was painting these stars, he was recreating Venus. He didn't know that at the time, but it was proved afterwards that whilst he was in this asylum, through the bars, that he didn't paint the bars in, but he was looking through bars, he recreated Venus. If your brush goes flat after you've wiped it, all I want you to do is take your fingers, sometimes you need to re-wet it, dry it and remould it back into that point. Don't try and paint a fine area with a flat brush. So we have most of the stars in, we have all the stars in now. So we're going to do the sweeping area down here. Okay, wash your brush off. If we light in first with lemon yellow, if your paint drags, just wet your brush off slightly. Remember, we don't want to lose the brush strokes. And to start to lay in the movement. Doesn't matter if it's not exact to the reference photo. What does matter is that we keep this curve. And make sure your paint doesn't go up any further than this on your brush. If it does, wash your brush off. Okay, so it's starting to drag a little. Best thing I can do is wash my brush off, dry it off, and reform that shape. There was too much paint clogging the bristles. That was starting to dry. And let's form the shape here. Okay, it's going to be, again, it's going to be about layering. Building up textures. Building up colours. This is dry enough now to go back to. So you can add another layer, cadmium yellow. And look to fill in some more weave of the canvas. And this is where you can start picking up powder blue. Don't be tempted to just paint around the outside. don't want to lose these lovely brush strokes that you've been building up. Keep with the same shapes, same movement. You can pick up some white over the powder blue to vary the depth. And add in some of this mid-tone blue we made. Still keeping to the same round brush. What I'm not doing is, as I get to this star, just skipping round the side of it. Okay, so I've washed my brush off, it was getting a bit clumpy. Okay, so that area is a bit too thick. So I need to walk away from it for a little bit. And pick up some of the darker cobalt. And add in a few brush strokes. So you're working between the colours on the palette. The only one we haven't added in is the cerulean blue hue. Okay, so as we get to the smaller stars, we then change direction around them. To create the movement and texture and the transition. Between the different areas. Take it right up to this centre swirl. You need to let the first layer set, so it needs to cure. And the reason why you have to do that is if you start to paint the second layer on too early, it will start to lift off. Put your second layer on slightly looser, okay, so slightly more dilute. Needs to move around. So this time you're doing it the consistency of single cream. So the first time was good quality custard, and this time is consistency of single cream. And you can do that just by dipping your brush into the water and pulling your palette, the paint in your palette out slightly. Which will give you a slightly looser consistency. And if your paint is cured underneath, it won't be lifting up. If it starts to lift off, it's not cured. You need to just leave it a little bit longer before you put your second layer on. With it being slightly thinner, it's easier to fill the weave of the canvas. You may think pattern work looks slightly naive, and I suppose Van Gogh's brushwork did appear naive. Okay, so we're starting to fill the gaps in the canvas. Add a little bit of cerulean blue in with powder blue. just to overlay the stars. On the outsides. Make sure you stay within the movement. Then you can always add some white. We need to make these stars really pop forward. So just use some white just to pick out some highlights and some brush strokes. And some movement. And then you need to let it dry, because if you don't let it dry, it won't cure and it will start to lift off. So you do need to let this dry before we go on to the next stages of adding a little bit more depth, a little bit of darkness into the very furthest bits of the scone. You can keep fiddling and keep fiddling, but at some point you have to decide when to stop. And we're at that point right now is to stop for this evening. Now what you can do is cling film your palette, however it really wouldn't save this acrylic because it's a plasticizer in it. It's going to set, so it's really not going to save your acrylic. The ideal thing to do would be to keep painting. That would be the ideal thing, but for tonight, with it being very late, I'm going to stop. I'm also starting to get lumps of set paint on my painting. If you start to get that, just dab it with a cloth and then go over it with some fresh paint. Okay, thank you very much for joining me on this section. What I'd like you to do is carry on filling in your sky, and I'll see you back here for the rest of adding the detail.